My talk is called Towards the Weatherproof Farm, and it's very much based on my work monitoring farms across the UK. Over the last 6 years or so, I've now monitored well over 100 farms right across the UK in all landscape types, all farm types. And it's now my sincere belief that poor soil health and pasture health is bringing systemic weaknesses to all farming types in all systems, all situations. And how it's hitting the bottom line specifically, we're seeing shorter grazing seasons, therefore longer housing periods and additional costs there, shorter growing seasons, lower production and potentially burning off, basically sort of drought, and that fundamentally is acting as a drag on stocking rates and farm incomes. So if we look at housing costs specifically, so the country average is £1.70 a day for cattle. If you're on 100 head of cattle, that's 25 grand. It's pretty much the largest kind of line on the top line, basically. So anything that we can do to address that can bring more kind of resilience and less need for subsidies, basically. So this talk really is about that, how we can turn those weaknesses, how we can turn those observations into opportunities. So we'll look at grass production data as a sort of lens through which to view this particular problem through, and that's basically because we have this data from AHDB through their Forage for Knowledge programme. The different coloured lines here show different years. So the blue line is 2018. So you might ask the question, well, what happened here in 2018, where this massive hole in the feed budget come from? Well, there was a massive drought then, if people will cast their minds back to then. Although similar this year, or last year if you like. So we might ask this question generally, do we agree with this statement that we have a need of water for yield? I think so. I think this certainly shows that. And, fundamentally you can grow a crop without nitrogen, but you definitely can't grow a crop without water. Plenty of nitrogen was going on at this point here, no growth response. So, I asked the farmers that I work with through my courses, do you now feel that drought is a threat to your own operation? In other words, you might say, was drought affecting this region for yourselves? Yeah, I think so. So then we can sort of zoom back to 2020, but it's effectively the same as 2022. This is 3 years and 6 now. Every other year is a drought year. So we come back to our grass production data. In this case, the green line is the one we're looking at. That is 2020. And same thing here. What happened there? Well, it was another drought. Yeah. So just to reiterate that point, we do need water for production. Without it, we're losing significant dry matter production, and we're winding back to sort of spring levels of growth. And the need for feeding out winter feeds, basically, all the costs associated with that, particularly in dairy operations. So we'd ask the question, well, what was the winter like before that? 2019, 2020. What was that winter like? Was it A, great, loved it, let's go again? Was it B, not particularly memorable? Or was it C, again, for those people that experienced it, probably it was C. So a very wet winter, the year where we had the whole of the east of England underwater. So what are those winters from hell like? Basically, we've got poaching, mud up to our eyeballs, field access issues, winter crops not getting in, loads of standing water. So, how do they affect the bottom line, these types of winters? Well, they affect the bottom line by extending housing periods, increasing bedding and feeding costs, later turnout dates, and yield penalties because you're having to put in spring crops rather than winter crops, for example. So the work that I do basically is to go around and look at farms, look at their soils, for example, and actually evidence, observations or monitor sort of in-field, barefoot, visual observations. So here's an example. This is Shropshire 2019, November, sort of the middle of the winter from hell, if you like. And this is the tail end of it, east coast of Scotland, overlooking the Cromarty Firth. No less than 100 mils of rain that month up until February, and then 120 mils of rain into the third week of February. So that winter was a wet winter, yeah? So the soils are saturated, right? That's why we're seeing all this standing water. That's the kind of like the standard kind of inference in that instance. Well, again, we can come in and do our monitoring. Monitoring is king in all of these cases, so identify the causes of any of those issues we're looking at. So if we're coming off the back of the winter from hell, the wettest winter on record, for example, and we get to this point here, which is the beginning of the first lockdown, just to remind you, yeah, if our soils were saturated at field capacity, where did all that water go? Why do we suddenly get to this point here and our production drops off a cliff? Well, we can actually dig a little deeper, sort of, kind of literally, and look at the soil itself. Yeah, and what we find underneath this standing water is dry soil. Yeah, you can see what it looks like when it's wet up here. It has this sort of shiny quality to it. The bulk soil has a much more kind of matte tone to it. It's dry. Same story here in Rocheshire. Here's your standing water in the field, and here's your man having handled that soil between his thumb and forefinger. Those hands are clean. Soil is dry. Yeah. Another example here, Forest of Bowland. Again, standing water in the field and blocky, dry soil, basically. Another example here from the Wirral. You can see what this soil looks like when the water goes in. That's where the spade went in. We dug it from this spot here, basically where the water is standing. But again, the bulk soil has that sort of matte quality to it. Another example. Again, lots of rushes, standing water, squelchy underfoot. And then when you actually come and look at the bulk soil itself, again, no evidence of sort of shininess, glossiness, glisteningness exactly. It generally has that sort of matte appearance to it basically throughout. And the final example, this one's from Sussex, so heavy clay soils. Again, loads and loads of standing water across the site, but the bulk soil is dry. So it's wet on top, but dry underneath. The soils are not saturated, and we're able to evidence this, time and time again, basically. So it's a soil type, right? It's got to be. Yeah, there's got to be an issue with something, that's intrinsic. Well, again, this is where we can take our monitoring, use our observation skills to understand the causes of the problems on your own operation, in your own site, on your own farm, for example, and we can use the infiltration rate test to do this work. This we would think of as the key indicator of a functioning soil. And we can use as our sort of over the fence sort of benchmark or control. Maybe look at the field versus the margin, for example, and do our infiltration rate tests. So here's Dorset, beginning of 2020. So sort of quite a dry period. We could get an inch of water in the field in 300 seconds or 5 minutes. Over the fence, full inch of water in 30 seconds. This example is from Wiltshire, similar story, 10 times quicker just over the fence. This one, in the open field, test abandoned at 20 minutes, over the fence, a full inch of water in 7 seconds. Similar story here, Shropshire Hills, Yorkshire Dales, test abandoned at 2 hours after maybe 5 mils of infiltration over the wall, full inch of water in under a minute. This one, half an inch in 6.5 hours. Next to the fence, on the inside of the fence, full inch in 8 minutes. And finally, again, half an inch in 6.5 hours compared to next to the hedge, where we got a full inch in 2 minutes. So in all these cases, the soil type is the same. Yep. So we can pretty much eliminate soil type factors that we're looking at here. The soils are also not saturated. We're evidencing that. The water is not infiltrating. So effectively we're eliminating kind of like, what's it called, environmental factors, tenure, altitude, soil types, and what we're left with is management. It's management that's different between these two comparative sites, basically. It's not the soil type. So this is when we can look at a rainfall simulator or a rainfall simulator. This is a device which you can't see up here. There's an oscillating sprinkler head, and it's just pushed out about 2 inches of water across these 3 separate trays. Yeah. So a lot of water, basically, about 2 weeks of rain in a single event, basically, to really highlight the difference between the different treatments. So on the left-hand side, we've got set stocking, the sort of traditional grazing management practices, and we've got loads and loads of water here in the runoff tub and loads of soil going with it, yeah, as opposed to the infiltration rate tub, not a lot in there. We move to rotational grazing, situations where we're moving animals fairly frequently, and we flip that on its head. Now we've got very little runoff, much more infiltration. Yep. And if we come to what they call pasture with longer recovery periods, so longer rest periods, taller grass, we've got a similar amount of runoff, but much less silt and otherwise sort of particulate matters in there, basically, so a clearer water. But also when we come back and look at the infiltration rate tub, we see it's not full to the top. So same amount in the runoff, same amount applied to the surface, less in the infiltration rate tub. Where must that water now still be? In the soil. Yeah. And again, same soil type, different management. So fundamentally, when we come back and talk about this example here, which would have been the same for last year now, effectively, we ask the question, well, what was the weather like? What does everybody else describe it as apart from farmers? What do they describe it like on the weather forecast? Again, this was the beginning of the lockdown, the first lockdown. Everyone's having a whale of a time, but hey, we're on furlough, you know. Suddenly got like really nice weather, basically. It's hot, it's sunny, cloudless, long days. Yeah. So when we think about that, we talk about, you know, production, basically. Where we are growing the same crop in a polytunnel compared to in the field, which yields more? It's the one in the polytunnel, isn't it? Otherwise, you wouldn't bother spending tens of thousands of pounds investing in this fixed infrastructure if there wasn't a guaranteed yield benefit, basically. And what is it about the conditions in the greenhouse or the polytunnel that makes it a high-yielding environment? Well, fundamentally, it's the heat, higher temperatures. Yeah. And then similarly, what is it about the sort of weather conditions in the south of France that make it a reliable place to grow oil seeds and hard wheats, sort of milling wheats, basically bread wheats? Well, fundamentally, it's those high temperatures and long sunlight hours. Many more sunlight hours than we generally get here in the UK. Yep. So it's basically sunlight, the main thing that we can't really rustle up generally. So fundamentally, we kind of think that this is a massive missed opportunity. Yep. To turn those threats into an opportunity, basically. So if our water infiltrated like this is a heavy clay soil in the middle of winter, yeah, after, you know, at least an extended wet period, loads of standing water in the open field, full inch of water infiltrating in just a few seconds. What's going to happen to our production when we get to this point here? Yeah, once we remove water as a limiting factor to growth, we're at least going to be matching what would normally expect. I think we'd be breaking records, fundamentally, because you can drive growth better with heat and sunlight than you can with anything out of a can, fundamentally. So if your land is basically going from like the Battle of the Somme to the Sahara in a few weeks, basically, you're looking at infiltration rate issues. You're just not using that water that God gave you. Yeah? If we're seeing burning off, effectively we're seeing a broken water cycle. Yeah? Drought is not a lack of rain. It is a lack of infiltration. Yeah? Still rains in the winter. Yeah? And it probably rains more now than it ever did in the winter. We're moving to more seasonal rainfall patterns, like Stephen was saying. Now, you know, April showers are a thing of the past, basically. Those dependable, predictable rains basically just don't really sort of exist anymore. Yeah? So we've got one chance to get the rain into the soil, and that's when it's actually raining. Yeah? Any time after that is just huge expense. Yeah? Infrastructure and capital, etc. So fundamentally, poor infiltration translates to wet ground in winter and dry ground in summer. It's both. Yeah? Wet ground in winter means longer housing periods and shorter grazing seasons, so higher cost of production. Dry ground in summer means lost production and burning off, and fundamentally reduced stocking rates, yeah, or increased costs to maintain those same stocking rates. And it all comes back to this point here, that a functioning water cycle, where the rain hits the land, It interacts with soil because the soil covers all the land and the rain falls on the land, basically. And in a functioning system, that water will infiltrate through that sort of soil skin, then re-enter groundwater recharge and emerge as springs, rivers, lakes at some point in the future, basically. So fundamentally, all the water that we can see, any open water, should have passed through a soil phase, basically. Except that what we have is the majority, if not all, of the rainfall basically just sheeting off. It all just runs off straight into our channels, and that's where we need natural flood management strategies basically to deal with that water there when it's already in a channel basically. But by the time you've done that, you've kind of missed the boat really. You've missed the opportunity to actually take advantage of that. Fundamentally, what we're looking at is very poor use efficiency of those free resources, the things that God gave you, the things that people aren't bagging up and selling back to us at elevated input prices. Yeah, so the sun, the rain, the air, basically. And this is all translating to lost production and increased costs of production. And then your opportunities turn into threats. Your excesses become problems. Rather than driving growth, they become a suppressor for growth. Rather than facilitating production, they act as a drag on production. They reduce stocking rates, for example. So what is the cause, fundamentally, of these factors that we're observing here? We think, ultimately, it is a lack of aggregate structure in soils, otherwise known as crumb structure. Yeah, what people describe when they're talking about boy soil in old money. So we use a baking analogy to illustrate this point here now. Who here eats biscuits? 2 hands at the back there. Great. So as we all know, the base ingredients for biscuits are sugar and flour. Yeah, and each individual sugar, grain is about the same size and shape as every other. And the same with your flour. If you allow those materials to self-organise when they're very homogeneous, regular, uniform, similar, they will form a very packed structure. Yeah, you pour those ingredients into the bowl, you sift it level, it just sits flat. You know, it occupies the entire space within that vessel. However, if we add a binding agent, we now create a non-uniform structure. If we look at these things, the largest one there might be 1/2 inch across, and the tiddlers in there might be a couple of mil. That's like a bowling ball next to a tennis ball. We've massively changed the consistency of that material just by adding a very, very small amount, in this case, of a binding agent. So we end up with a much more open structure. Well, so it is in the soil, basically. In this case, sand is analogous to our sort of granular, our sugar, and clay, a powder. If you get dried clay in a bag, it comes as powder, yeah? Again, these materials, regular, uniform, similar. If we allow them to self-organise, you will end up with a packed, blocky structure, basically. However, if we add some kind of sticky substances, glue-like substances, biotic glues, into our soils, we end up with an open, loose structure, yeah? Something that looks much more like this, yeah? So now, water is able to move through our soils, yeah, and also water is able to absorb into the individual crumbs, aggregates, etc., and also to form films around the individual particles, yeah. But at the same time, we're still able to allow gases exchange, so we can have a fully hydrated soil and still a fully aerated soil, yeah. So the take-home message here is when your soil is aggregated, it becomes loose. Yeah, if you take nothing else away from today's talk, then a well-aggregated soil is loose, or it is open. Yeah, so we can see into the soil. We can see sort of caverns, channels, alcoves, etc. And also these sort of rounded and kind of bobbly structures. They look a little bit like mini earthworm casts. They're not, but that's what we mean when we're talking about aggregates or crumbs. Yeah. So fundamentally, your loose soil absorbs water. It behaves like this, yeah? That means it kills drought, yeah? Because we're keeping that water, we're banking that water that we get in the rain, storing it in the soil that then the plants can then draw upon when it does get a bit warm and dry later on in the season, yeah? So we're beating drought and we're shortening housing periods. Yeah. So it might look something like this, for example, when it's being spaded. Yeah. So the spade just drops in with 1 foot, and then it comes out and it's loose. Yeah. You can feel that. You can feel it underfoot, and you can definitely feel it on the end of the spade. See the way it just all sort of breaks open? And this is what it looks like when it's actually in the tray. So the key point to understand here is that whatever you're blessed or cursed with, so if you start with a very heavy soil, clay soil, it'll be waterlogged in winter, potentially, or claggy, then it becomes lighter and more free draining. Yep. Or if it's very light, it becomes more loamy and more moisture retentive. But either way, it tends to a more mediated, more workable, more forgiving state, basically. So what is it that's making these binding agents, that's gluing together our soil particles to form crumbs? Well, basically, it's organisms. Yeah? Anyone ever got a slug on their hand or on their clothing? What's it leave behind? Sticky trail. What happens after a few days? It sets hard. Is it easy to get off? Probably not that easy. If we were reaching for something like that in the workshop, goes on sticky, sets hard, and it's hard to wash off, what are we talking about? It's glue, fundamentally. But it's your bacteria, your fungi, and other sort of microorganisms that are making these binding agents, that are gluing together your soil particles to create an open structure. So the way to think about it is like a mine. Yeah? Without the structure, your soils are basically like a mine. They're made up of mineral materials, basically, tightly packed, basically. It's only when you drill the channels, basically, you create the mine shafts, that you create that sort of connection that makes it functional, so you can get the material from the coal face out to its source, basically. And so it is in the soil. Yeah, again, it's your pit props. They're made of carbon. They're made of wood. Yeah, so your aggregate structure is carbon-based. Yeah, biotic glues, polysaccharides. So this is what we mean by functional organic matter, functional carbon in the soil. So the corollary to this is not nothing. The absence of aggregation isn't just sort of some weird kind of like null state, basically. The absence of aggregation is compaction. When you remove the pit props from the mine, it just collapses back to this dense mineral state, basically, because there's nothing holding it open. Yeah. So if we come back and look at some of these images we looked at before, so here's our blocky, dense, compacted on the left, loose, friable, open, aggregated on the right. And the same here, and here, and here, and here, and so on. And as well as that, so again, the key point to understand here, you see all these surfaces, the sort of shear faces, smooth surfaces, as opposed to this really crumbly, sort of non-uniform, sort of loose structure, basically. So aggregated on the right, compacted on the left. And with the compaction comes anaerobic conditions, falling pH, increased need for lime applications, etc. So again, it comes back to this point that the more aggregate structure you add to your soil, the more loamy, the more forgiving it becomes. But fundamentally, there's an intrinsic link between roots and aggregation. Yeah? Roots basically bring aggregate structure, and with it infiltration and water retention. Yeah? So without roots, we have no aggregation. With no aggregates, we have compaction, therefore no infiltration. Yeah? No roots means compacted soil that then becomes anaerobic with falling pHs. So again, we come back and look at this example again. So we have big roots on the right, little on the left. Big roots on the right, little on the left. And the same here, and the same here, and the same here. And if we look at these close up with the farmer here and ask the question, from a sort of production point of view, which of these two would you rather base your livelihood on? Which of these two is going to start growing earlier in the season? Which of these two is going to continue to grow when it gets dry? Which of these two is going to hold up animals longer when we go into the shoulder of the season and it gets a bit wet? And which of these two has the best infiltration? It's this one on the right. Yeah. So where we have the big roots, yeah, we have the good structure, and we have the excellent infiltration, and the same here. Again, small roots, blocky soil, dry soil, compacted soil, as opposed to dark, friable, aggregated soil with big roots and excellent infiltration, as opposed to just all this standing water. So the key point to understand here is this plant size that's really dictating what's going on below ground. Small plants equal small roots equal compacted soil. This is typical. Yeah, you see this like time and time again, basically. Fundamentally, small plants is leading to your long housing periods. Small plants is leading to drought. Small plants is leading to reduced stocking rates. And why is that? What is causing this? Fundamentally, again, it's management. We've identified that. Is everybody familiar with the bonsai tree? So you'd ask the question, you know, you kind of mature oak in a glass case. Is it any different genetics-wise than that sort of master oak growing out there in the hedge? No. It's genetically like equivalent, basically. What's different is the management. Management determines plant size, and it will massively size down those plants. Yeah? Same things happening here. Small plants, larger plants, big plants. Yep. So management equals production. So what we want to be doing fundamentally is tapping into the latent potential of all those hundreds of thousands of individual grass plants that are growing in all our pastures right now. Because root mass dictates infiltration, bigger roots equal healthy soil. Yeah? And the corollary being drought and short housing. So this is when we can talk about the pasture health principles and the soil health principles as ways to inform how we would actually start to review and critique our management practices. Because fundamentally there's something that's driving these small plants, open swards in open pastures, compacted soils, and it's grazing management, first and foremost. Yeah, and it's this term here, overgrazing. A much misunderstood term, basically. So we ask a question normally, what's the minimum number of animals it takes to overgraze a pasture? There is an answer. 1. Yeah, we've all seen those, you know, solitary horses just patrolling around, going, oh, I saw a bit of grass there, saw a bit of grass there. So fundamentally, overgrazing is a product of time, not numbers. Yep. 1 animal can overgraze a pasture if given enough time. So what is causing, you know, these processes to happen? Fundamentally, we need growth, or rather, growth requires energy. Yeah, the energy to grow plants comes from photosynthesis, as Stephen was talking about. When you've come along and defoliated the plants in your pasture and removed the leaves, where does the energy come from to regrow that first 5 days of leaf matter? Given the fact that you've removed the leaves, there's only one option, and that is from the roots. Yeah, 95% of the energy to regrow the first 5 days after being bitten comes from the roots. Yeah, so fundamentally, really we should be using this term, under-resting. Overgrazing really means under-resting. Plants being insufficiently recovered, under-rested before animals return to them. Yeah, the animals are spending too long in paddock, and they're running back and they're regrazing the regrowth. Those plants are only 3 or 4 days old, yum, 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 super tasty, super juicy. They'll take that over everything else every time. So if your animals are in paddock for a couple of weeks, they might regraze those day 1 plants, the best, tastiest, most palatable plants. They may regraze them 3 or 4 times. And that's why you end up with this. This is why you end up with bonsai plants, basically, because the animals keep nipping them off. Having each time they'll nip, nip and nip and nip. So fundamentally, set stocking is the sine qua non, the very definition of under-resting. Yeah. So we'll look at some examples again. We went back and talked, look at the example we looked at, sort of overgrazed versus rested. So set stocked on the left, rested on the right. Yep. And here's our rested ground with the excellent infiltration. So the power of rest is to bring you from shallow roots to deep roots, from blocky soil to loose soil, from small plants to large plants. And similar story here. Shallow roots to deep roots, compacted to aggregated. Fundamentally, rest equals bigger roots. Bigger roots equals aggregation and functioning soil. So when we're looking in pasture, we can look beyond just, well, we need to look above ground. So initially we could maybe do some soil tests, infiltration rate tests. Then we can go and look at the sward density, bare soil, or any potential undesirables in pasture. So sward density dictates or informs us about our total amount of leaf area, the number of plants per square metre, or the space between the individual plants. Yeah. So as you increase sward density, you increase total leaf area, therefore increasing your total potential for production, or otherwise total potential for sunlight harvesting. Yeah. Also, density equals production because we get more root mass. Yeah. That means more aggregate structure and more infiltration. Rather than having roots in one place with good aggregation, then a gap between the plants which is blocky, and then and back to plant, for example. So these are examples of places that I visited across the country, and these are typical kinds of situations. So a low sward density and lots of bare soil, lots of mosses, bare soil and small plants, or a lot of running grasses. These are really typical. Actually, I would say that like the majority of our permanent pastures are heavily represented with these plants that have very shallow roots. They just grow across the surface. They don't grow up, so they don't really give you much actual biomass production. So all of this is acting as a drag on production, and similar with mosses. Again, we see this like across the board basically. Moss is well represented in pasture. They have no roots, they produce no dry matter basically. They are an overgrazing indicator. And how that plays out, we think, is clumping grasses, the productive grasses are suppressed. That means rooting depth reduces, soil structure is lost, compaction and anaerobic conditions then abound, and mosses then expand basically. And the result is back to these all of these same points. So what is our response? Fundamentally, to take number one on the pasture health principles, and that is to move animals. Sounds like a bit of a no-brainer basically, but by doing that we are eliminating overgrazing and increasing production. Yeah? And the key point is that by moving our animals every 2 to 3 days maximum, we're avoiding the second bite. We're avoiding that situation when the animal runs back and nips off the regrowth. Yeah? And actually there's good data also from AHDB, who are not known for their unsubstantiated wild claims. So you would probably say this is probably more on the kind of conservative end basically, but switching from set stocking to paddock grazing increases utilisable dry matter by 92%. Yeah. So by changing how the grass is offered, not the type of grass or the type of stock basically, we have the potential to double our production and also increase growth rates. And other people, for example, the Progressive Farming Company, think we can get above that. Moving to daily moves, again, will take that one stage higher. So the idea that stocking rate is somehow what's it called, a drag on the system as a whole, or that we're anywhere near our stocking rate potentials, I think is highly questionable personally. I think we're massively understocked, and that is a good news story basically, because that means we don't need subsidies. So how can we move our animals? Subdividing paddocks with permanent fence, using temporary fence to create grazing cells, back fencing every 2 to 3 days, creating water lanes, mobile water, fixed earthing stations. All of these different factors basically can all be brought to bear. And actually most people say, oh, you can't move, it takes too much time to move animals. Well, with the right kit, things like the Kiwi Tech Power Pack for example, we can put out 100 metres of 3-strand fencing that is tensioned in 3 minutes. Yeah. So once you're already at the animals, you need to do a daily visit basically. So it might look something like this. And then when you wind it in, it collects in the wire, takes it off the posts, and collects the posts here. And that will do that with 1, 2, or 3 strands. So fully compatible with cattle or sheep or other stock classes basically. So effectively we've established that grazing management is our sort of top of the list. Our main opportunity to create change, create positive change, address issues with hydrological issues. Yep. But we can also use a few other levers, other tools to provide support to best practice grazing management. We can improve our sward diversity and density through other strategies. For example, if we are in a situation where we've got fairly poor improved pasture, or we're in a dairy situation, or we're already reseeding, for example, with new lays, then it's a no-brainer to go with herbal lays or other similar mixes, because they out-yield straight plants, single species plantings. So this is Reading University. They've demonstrated over 4 years, 4 different mixes over 4 years has the same production as straight ryegrass on 250 units of nitrogen. Show me another strategy that can lead to like 100% reduction in inputs overnight, and I'm interested. Yeah. But as well as that, there's also data coming off farm demonstrating actual performance for lambs, for example, which are known as being quite fussy, hard to actually finish, hard to get them to gain weight, particularly commercial lambs. And with the herbal lays, the pure herbal lay, they had 16% better live weight gains. And actually the introduction of perennial ryegrass into the blend resulted in a yield penalty. Yeah. So we can go further than that as well by incorporating silver pasture, like Stephen was talking about. Here's an example from Ireland. So here we have in the open field rushes dominating, but here where the trees are present, we have grasses dominating. So fundamentally, trees are actually favouring, they are supporting grasses, they are stimulating and cooperating. There's also good data coming from established agroforestry plots in Northern Ireland, which is probably similar, kind of climatically, to parts of Wales. They've demonstrated that with the agroforestry plots, that would have potentially 17-week longer grazing season, 5 weeks more in the spring and 12 weeks more in the autumn, because of reduced soil moisture compared to open grassland. And for those that wonder how we can incorporate trees into a grazed landscape, very simple. Again, just use the Kiwi Tech fencing, put it up during the duration of the animal's visit, and then take it down when they've gone. So again, how do we achieve our diversity and density objectives? Extend rest periods, graze standing hay, reseed with herbal lays, overseed, bale graze, green hay strew, etc. Yep. So the final point we'll make here basically is to move beyond these slides and say that we can be looking at transition tools, again in the way that we were looking at with things like overseeding. How can we give best practice grazing management a bit of a leg up? Well, fundamentally we can relieve compaction, for example, through mechanical, mineral and biological means. The go-to mechanical strategy we think is the Airworks roller slitter. It's a heavyweight drum slitter, so it's basically a flat roller with boron blades. And this works particularly well, or rather its optimal conditions is into very dry soil. Yeah, 1.5 tons of metal on the frame, 1 ton of water in the drum. We can force in those blades into the soil, combine that with high forward speed. Last year they were doing 25 kilometers an hour on gallops. Probably don't have big enough fields to get up to that, but basically the key point is that forward motion gives a lot of kinetic energy. When you force those blades into the ground, the energy can't be created or destroyed, and it can't go back up into the frame because there's too much mass. It's then released as a pulse. So the same idea as taking a hammer very gently to somebody's demonstration windscreen, just enough to get it actually to go, but not to sort of collapse. You get this whole radiating pattern of fractures and fissures or shatters from that single point of impact. Yeah. So long as the ground is dry, it won't then absorb that energy basically. So we effectively have a very fast, very cheap and low diesel subsoiler. Yeah. Another strategy would be something like the Missouri tine drill or a Claydon, for example. So in this case we've drilled in seed, so a bit of the biological and the mechanical. And what we found is between the drill lines, we infiltrated 1/2 inch of water in half an hour. On the drill line, 1 inch of water in 3 seconds or something like that, just went straight in. Yeah. So now, this winter, this field will be absorbing 50%, 60% more water than it would have done otherwise. We can also be looking at mineral interventions like gypsum, for example, at a fairly low rate, that acts to flocculate the soil, particularly on high magnesium soils or heavy soils, which creates these sort of molecular scale fractures. And there's good evidence to demonstrate that you get a significant improvement in infiltration rates with this strategy. But actually, when we combine it with the mechanical interventions, there's good evidence that it goes significantly further than either one of these interventions alone. And then we can also be pulling the biological lever. Yeah, so if we can boost root growth with nutrients, for example, phosphorus, sulfur, etc., yeah, that will bring more root mass, therefore more aggregation. Yeah. Otherwise, we can be applying biostimulants, compost, seaweed, for example, or slot seeding other deep-rooted plants potentially. But fundamentally, it's when we combine forces, do something mechanical and biological, like seed and subsoiling, mechanical and mineral, like airworks and gypsum, that we get the best of both worlds. Basically, it all goes beyond that. So this is what might look. So this is how we can convert a subsoiler, for example, so we can liquid inject biostimulants, for example, carbon, etc., whilst also relieving compaction. So the concluding points fundamentally is, if you're going to spend cash or where you should allocate resources on the whole on the farm, we would say that like the majority of that should go on tools or strategies that facilitate best practice management. Top of the list is always management. Yeah, so that's where we're looking at fencing and water infrastructure, basically, to facilitate the movement of animals. Yep. Then, once we've got that in place, we can be looking at soil interventions, for example, to help that management get underway, if you like, and then potentially reseeds, sort of later on, if you like. So fundamentally, the conclusions are here that it's management that is driving 90-something% of the issues that we're seeing with hydrology at the landscape scale, because 90-something% of it is under orthodox management, and 100% of that is pretty much in the states that we evidence. Yeah, poorly structured, small plants, small roots, very little infiltration rate. I actually did a presentation to an AONB up in North Yorkshire with all of their staff, and we did an infiltration rate test, poured the water, and it was pretty much there the entire time. We were there for 2 hours, basically. It can be that poor. So fundamentally, this is, speaks to the fact that this is an underused resource. Yeah. So the water is currently a threat, long housing or droughting off. But fundamentally, if we use it right, if we can take advantage of that, it is a free resource that is not going to run out. But how do we deliver on this? We move our animals and invest on infrastructure to make that happen. So that is it. Thank you very much.